Well, it's time for Karen Reed's second trial. Will it be guilty or not guilty? We're going to talk about that and a whole lot more on this episode of Charlie Crimebuster. It is what some people are calling the fastest minutes in podcasting.
The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are solely those of the individuals interviewed or participating and do not represent those of city, county, state, or federal law enforcement agencies, nor sponsors and platforms of this presentation. Charlie Crimebuster, CharlieCrimebuster.com, and PeacemakerNetwork.com are copyrights owned by Charlie Crimebuster. All individuals described or mentioned in the presentation should be considered innocent until found guilty in a court of law. This presentation contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener and viewer discretion is advised.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of Charlie Crimebuster. Sure glad to have you on the Charlie Crime Train today. Thank you for being a part of the podcast. Hey, we always like to invite you to reach out with a shout out if you are a seasoned listener or even a first-time listener, especially first-time listener. We would love to hear from you. You can reach me, Charlie Crimebuster, at gmail.com. That's Charlie Crimebuster at gmail.com. We're sponsored by PeacemakerNetwork.com. We'd love for you to read about the Peacemaker Network. You can even become a part of it by becoming a badge supporter, BADGE. That way you'll support the program, but more importantly, you will support those brave men and women who run toward danger instead of away from danger. You know who I'm talking about, right? Yep, we're talking about the first responders, the law enforcement, and also those brave men and women of our military. God bless them all. Well, you can read all about that at PeacemakerNetwork.com. And then, like James Buckland, our producer, often says, if you want to binge cast. I like that term, binge cast. You can do all the binge casting you want to by going to CharlieCrimebuster.com. CharlieCrimebuster.com. Over 200 episodes there of some of the most important and those that find it most interesting, those true crime stories out there. We always do true crime stories here at Charlie Crimebuster. And you can read about those stories by looking at the show notes, and you can listen to those stories by listening to the podcast. Over 200 of them over there at CharlieCrimebuster.com. All right, well, wait a minute. I thought we had all the housekeeping out of the way, but don't let me forget to tell you about our YouTube channel. Yep, YouTube channel. You see, James Buckland and I, we take times after we drop these podcasts, we take times to then do what we call a little, well, I guess I would call it a more deeper dive into the subject. And we talk about the podcasts that we released earlier. This next time on the YouTube channel, we'll be talking about two podcasts. The one we did last week when we talked about the unthinkable Karen Reed case, and the one this week when we're starting the series on the second trial. That second trial, by the way, is scheduled to begin this week. If you're listening to this in real time, this week, they're going to start the jury selection. And so if you want to get caught up, then go back to CharlieCrimebuster.com or go to our YouTube channel. Just YouTube it and tag it Charlie Crimebuster, and you'll find it there, and you can see and hear about James and I as we talk about the episodes. Now I think our housekeeping is over. By the way, if you haven't subscribed, be sure and hit that subscribe button. You'll find us on most all of the platforms, so hang in there with us, become a part of the Charlie Crime Train fan base. We would love to have you on board. All right. Karen Reed's second trial, well, it's just around the corner. That's right, this week. This will be the second trial now that this 40-year-old young lady, I say young lady, I guess I'm telling my age, right? This will be the second trial of Karen as she is again facing another jury. This is a highly charged case filled with controversy. Much of the local area, well, they're divided right down the middle between guilt and innocence of Karen Reed. That first trial, by the way, ended up with a hung jury. At least they were hung on one of three accounts. Now, we have been told that the jury actually agreed not guilty to two of the heavier charges, but they were divided on that third, less serious charge. Now, the defense has appealed against that mistrial, hoping that now she would only be charged in the second trial with the less serious charge that the first jury did not agree on. But that those two charges that they did agree on and say not guilty, they were hoping that they would be left out. And if you listened last week, we told you that that is now gone to the appeals court, even a higher appeals court, and they're kind of waiting to find out what the higher court is going to say about that. Now, the defense had asked, if you recall, last week, they were asking for the judge to delay it to give them time to get to those charges and to rule on those charges. However, the judge said, nope, we're not going to wait much longer. We've already summoned a whole bunch of people to jury duty, and it's going to be hard to get a jury of all the publicity that's going on. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to start jury selection. That may actually take several weeks. And during those several weeks, they are hoping that they will hear from the higher court. She did say that once the jury has been selected, if the higher court has not ruled, she may then agree to delay the trial till they hear from that high court. No guarantees, but that might be what happens. So there's where we are, but I wanted to get you up to date, and we wanted to just start talking about this highly charged case that's beginning this week with jury selection. Now, John O'Keefe, of course, he was age 46 when he was discovered dead in his colleague's front yard on January the 29th, 2022. You see, a group of friends, acquaintances had gathered there for an after-party following an evening of drinking in Canton, Massachusetts. Now, prosecutors, they claim that Reed accidentally struck him with her Lexus, and they're even charging her now with intent. They said that happened during a disagreement under the influence of alcohol. And then she drove away, leaving him to die of his injuries in that severe cold weather. Actually, it was a northeastern snowstorm that hit. Well, now she's pleaded not guilty. She's claimed now that she's being scapegoated by investigators. And a lot of those people, she says, they are helping to cover for the real killers. It was a so-called cover-up scheme. And her defense, they talked about the many connections between O'Keefe, who, by the way, was a Boston police officer, and the other people that were present inside the home there where he died in that yard, and the investigators who worked the case. In other words, there's a lot of connection. You see, Brian Albert, who's a retired Boston police officer, he actually hosted a group at his house after they had been drinking at the Waterfall Bar and Grill in Canton. That's a suburb of the city, of course, of Boston. So let's talk about some of those people that were in that house where John had died in the front yard. Well, the first one is Brian Albert. He was the owner of the house. He is a retired Boston police officer now. He wasn't retired then, but he is retired now. And there was also Albert's brother, Kevin Albert. Kevin Albert, here's some of the people that you're going to hear about in this coming trial. Kevin Albert is a detective in Canton. That was the jurisdiction where O'Keefe was found dead in his brother's front lawn. Now, interesting enough, Kevin Albert, listen to this, you're going to hear about this a little later in the podcast, but Kevin Albert, he was suspended back in September for allegedly drinking on the job. Now, that's according to Boston 25. So the Alberts, you see, who come from a family of 6 siblings, they also have a sister-in-law who Reed's defense says is close friends with the family of Michael Proctor. Michael Proctor is the lead investigator on the case. By the way, as we reported last week, he was fired from the Massachusetts State Police. Now, there was another member of law enforcement who was after this after party, and his name was Brian Higgins. Higgins is a federal agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. Now, according to testimony in that first trial they had, now get this, hang on to this one because it's important for you to fit it into this puzzle that we're talking about. Brian Higgins, who is the ATF agent, he and Karen Reed, who is defendant, they did share some romantic text messages. And he also testified that she one time kissed him outside O'Keefe's house before his death. Now you see where we're going all this? He was inside that house. That house where O'Keefe died in the front yard. Brian was there. And Brian and Karen, well, there is, of course, allegations that they might have had something going on. Well, with everyone connected, and Reed being an outsider, you see where this is going, the defense says now that she has been framed in a cover-up. In fact, one of the guys said, the old saying is, if you can't attack the evidence, attack the investigators. But this person said, however, in this case, well, the defense had a field day with both the evidence and the investigators. And boy, that really happened in that first one. By the way, here's something really interesting I found out just this week. And you may have already known it, but there's an alternate juror on the first case. You know, you have the juries there, and they also have alternates in case something happens to somebody that's in the jury box and they can't proceed. Then they put an alternate juror on that was listening to the trial so that they could step right in and take the place. Well, there was an alternate juror, and this juror was a lawyer, and this one sat through the original trial, but did not take part in the deliberations. Listen to this. She, according to news, she was so disenchanted with the legal process, she actually ended up joining Reed's defense. That's right. This alternate juror in the first trial now says, hey, I want to go work for Reed's defense because I think she's getting a bad deal. I think she's being railroaded. I think she is the scapegoat. So she's turned around and now joined the defense team, Reed's defense team. Now, after that first mistrial, they decided to bring in another person to try the case. It is a special prosecutor. He has been appointed to spearhead the second case. Now, in that first case, there was a prosecutor, but he's being replaced. And the guy's name that's replacing him is a guy by the name of Hank Brennan. He, by the way, is a private attorney, and you probably heard about him before. He actually represented the Boston gangster, James Whitey, in federal court. Now, here is what he said, and this is a really good soundbite, by the way. I don't know who wrote it for him, but this is what he says. This is what Hank Brennan says. He says, quote, I assume full responsibility and all obligations for prosecuting this case, and I will do it ethically, zealously, and without compromise. That's what he had told the Associated Press after he was named the special prosecutor. He went on to say, I have two core obligations. Number one, to make certain that Karen Reed receives a fair trial. And the second one is to ensure that the facts surrounding John O'Keefe's death are fully and truly aired in the courtroom without outside influence. Well, we'll see, right? You see, now, Reed has failed repeatedly, her team has, to have the case dismissed before the second trial. But Brennan's team will now have to overcome all of the mistakes that the first prosecution made. And boy, they made a lot of them, including the fact that the lead detective, Michael Proctor, well, he was fired. That was after he had shared inappropriate texts about the investigation with people who weren't working the case. And there were some really, really nasty things that he said about the defendant that he was investigating. It was indeed inappropriate. Also, that snowy evening, or that snowy morning, remember it's snow, it's a blizzard, the Canton police actually collected evidence in red Solo cups at the scene. Now, that's not normally what you do. You don't normally use red Solo cups to collect evidence, but they did. And so now, of course, Reed's lawyers, they jump all over that, and they are now accusing them of planting O'Keefe's blood on her car. You see, the police had access to O'Keefe's blood, and they also had access to the car. Does this remind you of anything? Can you say O.J. Simpson? O.J. Simpson, he was declared not guilty, and that was primarily because of the way that the defense attacked the investigation. And also there was a lot of racial tension at that time of O.J.'s trial. But that's the way it's being played here. That's the way it was played in the first case, that the Canton police really blotched this investigation. And they also argued in that first one that the prosecution never explained the cut and gashes found on O'Keefe's arm. And additional complications to this that the prosecution is going to have to overcome. You see, in the autopsy, it was not ruled that this was a homicide. The ruling manner of death, well, it's a homicide, but the manner of death was ruled as undetermined manner of death, undetermined manner of death. The cause was listed as blunt impact injuries to his head and, of course, hypothermia. You see, the autopsy did find skull fractures, brain bleeding, swollen black eyes, cuts to his right arms. But the forensic pathologist held off on really calling it a homicide. You see, he was still stuck with a case that had all these mistakes and reasonable doubt. And then all this media attention on top of it. Now, here's where they are. In finding a jury, it's going to be tough because there's been so much media attention. It's just going to be tough to find a juror who doesn't know anything about this case. I mean, they would have to be not only living under a rock, they'd have to be living under a rock on a deserted island to not hear about this case. I'll take it one step further. You're not just living under a rock, you're living under a rock on a deserted island if you haven't heard about this case. So now, we've told you a little bit about some of the people that you're going to be hearing about in the second trial, the same people we heard from in the first trial. Next, we're going to take a moment, we're going to focus on the main characters in this real-life drama. We're going to tell you a little more so that you'll be ready for this coming second trial. We're going to tell you a little more about John O'Keefe and Karen Reed. But first, let's take just a moment to share with you Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. Well, my friend, on our podcast, we often tell folks, if you see something, go ahead. Oh, yeah, you go ahead and fill in the blank. If you see something, you know what I'm trying to say. If you see something, yep. If you see something, say something. We tell you, if you see something, say something. Well, in this Crazy Crook story, someone not only saw something, someone did something. He got involved. Now, this could be a good move or a not so good move, depending on the circumstances. Don't you agree? But in this case, it not only became a good move, but it was a crazy move, and here's how it happened. You see, a good Samaritan happened to be in the right place at the right time when he saw someone robbing an elderly man. So, our hero jumps to the rescue and punches the thief. Now, that may not have gone down so well if that thief had had a weapon. So you've got to be careful when you get involved in these things. You certainly should see something, say something, do everything you can to help, but watch out for your own safety. Don't find yourself facing a man with a gun and you're not armed. Don't find yourself facing someone with a knife and you have nothing to defend yourself. But in this case, it worked out well. The Good Samaritan could have been killed, but in this situation, it worked out well. He just went in and punched him. But wait a minute. Here's where it gets crazy. This thief could not believe that someone would interfere with his own robbery. yet alone punch him. He became so upset, he called the police to complain. Yep, called the police to complain. And of course, that led to his own arrest for robbery of an elderly person. So my friend, this crazy crook, whose own robbery was foiled by a good Samaritan who punched him, and then the crook calls the police to complain? Well, he does indeed become Charlie Crimebuster's Crazy Crook of the Week. All right, friend, back to our main focus. This week, jury selections to begin in the trial that will captivate millions of people. Now, I told you about some of the people that will be a part of this trial. Now, let's refresh you with the two main people that this is all about. First, the victim, John O'Keefe III. His nickname was JJ, or Johnny. He was born on December the 8th, 1975. He grew up in Braintree, Massachusetts. He went and graduated from the Braintree High School and also, get this, from Northeastern University. And he is one of those go-getters because he even earned a master's degree in criminal justice from the University of Massachusetts. Now, he had lived in Canton since 2014. And JJ, or John, he was a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department. Now, just a post note here. John's brother Paul was quarterback at the Stonehill College football team. Now, you're probably wondering why that's important. Well, earlier we talked about how all these people were connected. Well, Paul, he was teammates. John's brother Paul was teammates with Lieutenant Brian Tully. Brian Tully was the lead detective supervisor at Norfolk County District Attorney's Mass State Police Investigative Unit. And he, my friend, was the supervisor of Michael Proctor, who was fired because of the inappropriate behavior. So you see how this is all connected? Now, I'm saying this because you have all heard of the blue wall. That blue wall, a wall that we police sometimes stand behind with each other through thick and thin. Sometimes in a good way, sometimes in a bad way. But be careful. Don't read too much in this, folks. It is common and natural for these people to be connected. Just as you are connected with the people you work with, so are cops connected with the people they work with. This does not automatically say that you would lie and commit perjury for your coworkers. And it should not be said that that automatically means that cops would lie and commit perjury for each other. Now, to be sure, I know for a fact in this case there was inappropriate things done in the investigation. But as I said last week, being inappropriate does not mean corruptions. Inappropriate does not mean corruptions. I said inappropriate, it's inappropriate. Inappropriate does not mean corruption. This is for you to decide in your own minds, and more importantly, for the jury to decide. But back to John. He was kind. He was loyal. He was dependable. He was gregarious. He was fun, all-around great guy. And John came from a family of cops. His father, John the First, was a Boston cop. Interesting, his badge number was 490. Now, John, he wanted to wear that same badge number. The identical badge, though, was not available. But they did give him that same number, 490, with a 2 preceding it. So he wore the badge 2490 in honor of his family. Now I'm going to be beyond this. I'm going to tell you something else that stood out to me as far as his own loyalty to his own family. About 9 or 10 years ago, John's sister Kathy died of cancer. Of course, the family was devastated. John loved his family dearly. And if that was not enough, around 2 months after that, John's brother-in-law, the father of those 2 children who had lost their mother with cancer, about 2 months after that, he died with a heart attack. But John, he jumped right in, took his niece and nephew and raised them as his own. And according to all people involved in this story, he loved those kids dearly. Think what an incredible man this is. A cop, a good one. Prepared himself well. College, a master's degree in criminal justice. And the greatest role of all, a parent to his niece and nephew. This great man dies in his own prime in a terrible way. I hope, folks, as we get into this case, we will not lose sight of what a great guy John was in all of the controversy and mercy. Now let's talk a little about Karen, the defendant. She was born in 1980. She grew up in Taunton, Massachusetts, as well as Blacksburg, Virginia. She graduated from a private Catholic school in Massachusetts and went to Bentley University, where she graduated with a bachelor's degree, and get this, she too had a master's degree in finance. Now, she had been a financial analyst at Fidelity Investments. She'd been there, I guess, since 2007. And she even lectured as a professor at Bentley University. And she was living in Mansville at the time of John's death. Now, in her own words, she tells a story how she first met John in high school back in 2004. However, she had left to work in Ireland for her first job, but then she returned back during the pandemic. You remember that, right? That pandemic that really stopped the whole world for a while. Well, during the pandemic, she got on Facebook, and she noticed that John was on Facebook, but she noticed that he had children. So she thought he was married with children, but then she found out that he had adopted them, and during the lockdown, they had connected on Facebook. And so they are now together, and a romance begins between the two. Now, there are a whole lot of people who talk about how they appear to be in love with each other, that they were good for each other. But then again, who knows what goes on behind closed doors, right? There was another side being told by other people. So you see where this is going? It's divided right down the middle. Now, there is testimony in the first trial about how they appeared to be in love and doing well on the night of the incident. One lady even said she wished her husband would treat her like John was treating Karen. They appeared to be doing well that evening. So as we begin to get into the second trial, I want to just set the stage a little bit and tell you a little bit about Karen and John and how they were brought together. And on that first day, that day of that terrible thing, there's a couple things I want to tell you before we leave today's podcast. Karen has now spoken out about what happened that night. She wasn't speaking out at the trial, but she has talked to the press and the media. She says early that morning that they had argued about the kids. It appears John thought that Karen was spoiling the kids. They disagreed about that. Now, none of us know what happens behind closed doors, as I said earlier, but we do know that couples always have moments of disagreement. But it appears that kind of was all over when they met together later that night. Now, she had left that day to go to her house to work remotely. You see, there was a forecast of that major snowstorm coming into the area, blizzard-like winds. At 6 p.m., she had talked to her dad. Her dad urged her not to go out that night, but to stay home because of the weather conditions. Boy, now, she says, she wished she had heeded her father's advice. If she had, well, maybe John would still be alive. But she didn't. And around 9 o'clock, they met at a local bar there. And then a little later, around 11 o'clock, they went to another bar called the Waterfall Bar. There they met Jen and Matt McCade. Now, Jen had coached John's niece in basketball, so they knew Jen. But while they were there, they also met up with Brian and Nicole Albert. And then Brian Higgins. All these people were in that house that he died in front of. Now, Karen said they had only met the Alberts the first time the previous weekend. And later, John told Karen that Jen had invited them to the Alberts' house for an after party. She said, sure, let's go. So, now there's something else she said, and I think this really says a lot about what happened. She said that this group, another group of cops in the areas, would often go out drinking and then would drive intoxicated home. And then she said this, nobody gets pulled over. So you see where the defense is going with this? They're planning the siege, that cops all stick together, and they take care of each other. And that has been true. In fact, in this trial, we find that the lead investigator, Michael Proctor, had met someone for drinks and driven his issued police cruiser afterwards. That was a part of the charges against him where he got fired, which is against police policy. So we all know what happens now. She drove to 34 Fairview Lane. She lets John out. She says he went to the house, went in the side front door, and that was the last time she saw him. Prosecution says, nope, she backed into him that night. She hit him. Even some have alluded that she hit him intentionally. She says no, he went into the house. Well, what do you think? You've heard about the first trial. What do you think really happened? And how will the second trial be different from the first trial? Well, we're going to tell you all about that next week. But I wanted you to know who the characters are, and I wanted you to know who the main characters are, and I wanted you to know that when we talk about victims of these crimes, they are real people. And it is tragic how people lose their life due to crime, or due to drinking, or due to drugs. It is terrible how people lose their life too early. John, as we know, was not a driver that night. There was nothing that he was doing that was wrong or incorrect. But there was a lot of alcohol that comes into this story. So think about that. All right, this is Charlie Crimebuster. We're going to pick this up next week, and we're going to get into what really happened on that fateful night. Or at least we're going to hear what the prosecution says happened, and then what the defense says happens. And then we're going to get in and have more news about the jury selection for you next week. Till this time next time, this is Charlie Crimebuster reminding you, be safe, be alert. Yep, for the life you save, it may be your very own.
You have been listening to Charlie Crimebuster. You can find additional podcasts at charliecrimebuster.com. You can also support our first responders, military, and law enforcement communities at peacemakernetwork.com. Or subscribe to our YouTube channel using tag @CharlieCrimebuster. Even visit our Facebook page, facebook.com/CharlieCrimebuster. Or if you would like to make suggestions for future podcasts, please send your ideas to charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. That's charliecrimebuster@gmail.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us next week for another exciting crime story with Charlie Crimebuster.